really interesting article I came across here that was written by Ben Norton, really amazing independent journalist, works with the Gray Zone and has published in a lot of other outlets and done various interviews and whatnot. So check this out. George Orwell was a reactionary snitch who made a blacklist of leftists for the British government. Again, Orwell wrote 1984 and Animal Farm and some other works as well. I'm assuming those are kind of two that I'm most familiar with. It is fascinating seeing people in the 21st century, especially self-declared leftists, still lionizing George Orwell, the worst kind of reactionary turncoat. Excuse me. For years, the cat has been out of the bag. George Orwell secretly worked for the UK's Foreign Office. Not a good look, indeed. At the end of his life, he was an outright counter-revolutionary snitch, spying on leftists on behalf of the imperialist British government. I mean that. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I've always appreciated. I like 1984 as a book. I found it pretty entertaining, but I don't think I ever lionized him. But I think, as he rightly points out, some on the left have. And after maybe being exposed to this, those people would maybe have second thoughts about doing that, as he was a counter-revolutionary snitch, not somebody, not somebody any leftist should be propping up as some type of hero or savior or whatnot. The U.S. government also found Orwell's work quite useful. The coup plotting, death squad training assassins and torturers at the Central Intelligence Agency turned Orwell's books into a propaganda weapon. The CIA even funded the Animal Farm movie, wow, which is now mandatory viewing in many high schools. Check that out. But what happened after Orwell's death in 1950? What is more scandalous is that he knowingly collaborated with the U.S. government when he was still alive. Wow. Never, never a good look to be a collaborator with the U.S. government. I mean, nothing good's gonna come from that. And it's not surprising, I guess, if Orwell was collaborating with the British government, the UK Foreign Office, and Orwell's list is a term that should be known by anyone who claims to be a person of the left. It was a blacklist Orwell complied for the British government's Information Research Department, anti-communist propaganda unit set up for the Cold War. The list includes dozens of suspected communists, crypto-communists, socialists, fellow travelers, and even LGBT people and Jews. Their names scribbled alongside the sacrosanct 1984 author's disparaging comments about the personal predilections of those blacklists. I mean, that's damn near like Nazi type shit, basically. Because that's who the Nazis, targeted all of those groups. Not sure what fellow travelers meant exactly, but the document was declassified by the British government in 2003. The leading neoliberal newspaper, yeah, The Guardian is trash, he's right. The Guardian reported at the time that the blacklist contains the names of 38 public figures, from the actors Charlie Chaplin and Michael Redgrave to the author J.B. Priestley, whom Orwell suggested should not be trusted by the IRD, that's the Information Research Department, as an anti-communist propagandist. Timothy Garton Ash, the historian who obtained the document, revealed that Orwell gave the blacklist to his close friend Celia Kirwan, who worked for the Foreign Office's Information Research Department, from his sickbed in May 1949. Orwell had told Kirwan in April that the list included journalists and writers who, in my opinion, are crypto-communists. Fellow travelers are inclined that way and should not be trusted as propagandists. There seems to be general agreement by Orwell fans, left and right, to skate gently over Orwell's suspicion of Jews, homosexuals, and blacks, also over the extreme ignorance of his assessments, wrote legendary radical journalist and Alexander Cockburn, sardonically referring to the anti-communist blacklist as Sir George list. Cockburn's pretty awesome. If any other post-war left intellectual was suddenly found to have written many diatribes about blacks, homosexuals, I prefer probably gay, about blacks, gays, and Jews, we can safely assume that the subsequent commentary would not have been forgiving. He added, "Here, there's barely a word." Cockburn's The Nation article on the subject, Sir George's List, is difficult to find today. I've republished it in full below. The article also expanded into The Fable of the Weasel, Cockburn's foreword for John Reed's Animal Farm parody, Snowball's Chance. I believe Snowball was one of the pigs in Animal Farm, right? Apologists insist Orwell simply sold out later in life and became a cranky conservative, yet the story is more complex. Orwell had a consistent political thread throughout his life that explains how he could go from fighting alongside a Spanish Trotskyite militia in a multi-tendency war against fascism to demonizing the Soviet Union as the real enemy, before returning home to Imperial Britain, where he became a social democratic traitor who castigated capitalism while collaborating with the capitalist state against the revolutionaries trying to create socialism. Sure, the USSR did some objectionable things, but it was also only the large country in the entire world that supported the Spanish Republicans in their fight against fascism, excluding a bit of support from Mexico. Soviet Union understood that one cannot have a revolution if one cannot defeat the fascist counter-revolution first, a lesson many on the left still have not learned today. Yet, leftists like Orwell and his devoted followers continue to lament Kronstadt and revel in their ideological purity while conveniently living relatively comfortable lives in Western imperialist countries that commit much more heinous crimes throughout the world every day. Orwell spent World War II writing about how evil the Nazis destroying the USSR was. Orwell's infantile politics are most evident in his magnum opus 1984, and one of the most important views of the book was not by a political scholar, philosopher, I didn't know this, but rather by none other than science fiction master Isaac Asimov, which he is a science fiction master. What is that series? Foundation, the Foundation series, excellent. I've read a couple of those. I highly recommend checking out. In his review of 1984, Asimov rips the novel to shreds. He also points out a shocking fact that conveniently escapes the myriad disciples of the British author. George Orwell spent the peak years of genocidal destruction in World War II writing a childish story about how evil the Nazi-killing Soviet Union supposedly was. And again, anytime we talk about World War II, we need to point out how the USSR played the biggest part in defeating Nazi Germany. It was something like 26 million Russians died fighting back Hitler and his forces. Okay? Wasn't the US, wasn't Britain, wasn't anybody else. We predominantly beat back the fascists and the Nazis because of the USSR, the Eastern Front, as they say. And Asimov points out Orwell wasn't affected apparently by the Nazi brand of totalitarianism, for there was no room within him except for his private war with Stalinist communism. Consequently, when Great Britain was fighting for its life against Nazism, and the Soviet Union fought as an ally in the struggle and contributed rather more than its share in lives lost and resolute courage, Orwell wrote Animal Farm, which was a satire of the Russian Revolution and what followed, picturing it in terms of a revolt of barnyard animals against human masters. He completed Animal Farm in 1944 and had trouble finding a publisher since it wasn't particularly a good time for upsetting the Soviets. As soon as the war came to an end, however, the Soviet Union was fair game and Animal Farm was published. Orwell wrote this childish novel, now basically mandatory reading in U.S. high schools. I do believe I read it in maybe junior high or high school, like he points out. In 1943 and 1944, at the height of the Nazi Holocaust, that is to say, while the genocidal Nazi regime was mowing down Red Army soldiers with warplanes, tanks, and machine guns, and while SS officers were shoving Jews, Romani, and disabled people into ovens and gas chambers, George Orwell was occupying his time writing a story about barn animals and how Stalin was a big mean pig. The Battle of Stalingrad, one of the largest battles in human history, ended in 1943, the year Orwell began work on Animal Farm. In this battle alone, 500,000 Soviet soldiers sacrificed their lives to defeat fascism. Wow. Oh, I was right. In the entire war, more than 26 million Soviets died, compared to just around 400,000 Brits and 400,000 Americans. Even virulent right-wing colonialist and racist Winston Churchill and veteran anti-communists had to admit the undeniable fact that it is the Russian armies who have done the main work in tearing the guts out of the German army, or as he repeated in 1944, it is the Red Army that has torn the guts out of the filthy Nazis, like I pointed out. But if you are to read Orwell, you would think that the Soviets were the real evil ones, and Asimov observed in his review of 1984, Orwell didn't want readers to mistake the villains for Nazis. The picture Stalinism and Stalinism only. Be interesting. I maybe need to go back and read 1984 to kind of pick up on these narratives. In fact, Orwell had nothing at all to say about the enormous Soviet sacrifice in World War II. He was much more interested in demonizing the USSR and everything it stood for, because like too many anti-communist leftists, Orwell's hatred of communists exceeded his hatred of genocidal fascists, something he shared in common with conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Isaac Asimov was no communist. He was much more a progressive New Deal Democrat, but even he was shocked at Orwell's childish personal obsessions, noting that to the end of his life, he, Orwell, carried on a private literary war with the communists, determined to win words in the battle he had lost in action. Damn, this is a long article. Asimov was also struck simply by how bad 1984 was as a piece of literature. I read it and found myself absolutely astonished at what I read, he calls. I wonder how many people who talked about the novel so glibly had ever read it, or if they had remembered it all. I felt I would have to write a critique, if only to set people straight. But there is a reason we remember Orwell, and it is not because of his literary prowess, it is because of the novel's political utility to reactionary capitalist imperialist governments. I mean, that makes sense why it's so prevalent and propped up in the West. Asimov is careful to point out, by the time the book 1984 came out in 1949, the Cold War was at its height. The book therefore proved popular. It was also a matter of patriotism in the West to buy it and talk about it, and perhaps even to read parts of it, although it is my opinion that more people bought it and talked about it than read it, for it is a dreadfully dull book, didactic, repetitious, and all but motionless. A complete opposite from Asimov's books. Again, highly recommend the Foundation series. From British colonial officer to anti-communist snitch. None of this is to even mention the earlier life of George Orwell, the pen name of Eric Arthur Blair, of no familiar relation to Tony Blair, although their fake left-wing politics are certainly related. The son of a British colonial officer from a wealthy landed family, Orwell made no secret of the fact he began his career as a British imperial officer working in the Crown's colonial colonies in Southeast Asia. Sure, Orwell later denounced his past work on behalf of the British Empire, but he held on to his colonialist mentality. Orwell's politics are social chauvinist in the raw sense. It is no coincidence that many of his avowed admirers today lionize and whitewash revolutionary extremists, Salafi jihadist militias in Syria and Libya, while at the same moment violently condemning progressive revolutions in Cuba, China, Vietnam, Venezuela, beyond his mere Stalinist bureaucracies. That is to say, it should come as no surprise that the architect of Animal Farm is adored by the likes of Christopher Hitchens and Michael Weiss. George Orwell was the first in a long line of trots turned neocons. And then, so that is Cockburn's article below. Not going to read anymore because this was a lengthy, very well detailed piece by Ben Norton and sheds completely different light on Orwell for me and his works. Frankly, next time in conversation somebody brings up Orwell, I'm going to have to point out that he worked with the UK's Foreign Office, provided them lists of socialists and Jews and gay people and crypto communists, fellow travelers, whatever that is. I mean, and even a list for the US government. I mean, it's disgusting. That's gross. People need to be remembered in their full capacity, not just how we like to think of them as. So, kudos to Ben Norton writing this article back in 2016 and shedding some light on George Orwell, the reactionary snitch.